Story 1. Manager forces me to get a doctor's note despite it being illegal to do so. Doctor writes him the most passive-aggressive note signing me off for 2 weeks instead of 2 days to teach him a lesson. I posted this but it got removed and I think it was maybe because I didn't make the malicious compliance clear enough, so I'm going to try again and make it extra clear. When I was in my early 20s, I worked at a supermarket. I should note that I was a pretty reliable employee. I was never late, in fact, I often got in early, and I rarely called in sick. At the time this happened, I had not called in sick for 9 months, and even then, the manager had sent me home. I had been up all night, swinging between burning hot and freezing cold, so I was obviously feverish, and I had been throwing up, at both ends shall we say. At one point at about 2 a.m. I was on the toilet, with my head in the sink, utterly miserable. I must have passed out because the next thing I knew I was lifting my head off the sink and it was 7 a.m. I was due to start work at 12 that day, but that obviously wasn't going to happen. So I called up the manager. Let's call the manager Steve. Steve was known for being a real a-hole. He never believed anyone who called in sick except his best buds, usually other managers, never lowly staff, but often called in sick himself. A lot of the time we knew it was because he was hungover and not actually sick. The conversation went as follows. Me: "Hey Steve, sorry, I can't come in, I'm sick." Steve: "With what?" Me: "I don't know. I think it might be the flu. I've been up all night being sick, and I have a fever." Steve: "Don't be stupid. If you had the flu you'd be completely knocked out. I need you in. Come in or you're fired." Me: "I can't. I just told you I can't stop vomiting. I passed out." Steve, growling angrily: "Either come in or bring a doctor's note, or you're fired." In the UK, you are legally allowed to self-certify for 5 days. This means you can tell your employer you are sick and you do not need a doctor's note. If you're sick for more than 5 days, you then need a note. It is also illegal to demand a doctor's note during the self-certify period. I knew this, but I was terrified. This was during the recession. I couldn't afford to lose my job. So I got myself dressed. Almost passed out trying to do so. Then trudged to the doctor's, some 25 minutes walk away. I end up sitting in the doctor's office for a little over an hour, which for walk-in was pretty good. I get in to see the doctor and she is furious at me for coming in. You're not supposed to come to the doctor's when you have a cold or flu, and of course I knew I should be able to self-certify. She told me as such, saying I shouldn't be here and should have stayed at home. I then explained what had happened with Steve and how he had threatened to fire me over this and I couldn't afford to lose my job. I was struggling as it was. My doctor turned her anger towards my manager. She asked if I got sick pay from the company, and I said yes. He wants a sick note, does he? The doctor says. Okay, I'll give him a sick note. Now, my manager just wanted a note confirming I was sick, but instead my doctor wrote something along the lines of this. OP has come to the surgery because manager Steve has insisted she come in spite of the fact that this is illegal and all employees are allowed to self-certify. Due to being forced to make this unnecessary and highly dangerous trip when the patient is ill, has a fever of 39 degrees Celsius, and almost passed out in the waiting room, I am signing OP off for 2 full weeks to recover. Had OP been allowed to self-certify as is the law, they might only have needed a few days, but due to straining themselves, they now require 2 full weeks. They are not to be permitted to work until date 2 weeks later. The doctor said she would have signed me off longer, but this was the longest she could do without requiring further evidence. So basically, instead of just being off for a few days, I was now signed off for a full 2 weeks, and I'd be paid for it. I went to my place of work, at which point one of the duty managers saw me and asked me what the heck I was doing here. Go home. I was obviously very unwell. I explained what happened. They agreed to help me downstairs to Steve's office and went with me inside. I handed Steve the note. He looked worried and tried to say, "I wasn't being serious about firing you." "Well geez, when you angrily growled it down the phone it sure sounded like it." The duty manager then declared that they were going to drive me home. It was clear Steve wanted to argue but had the sense to know he shouldn't. The duty manager then drove me home, made sure I was okay, then went back to work where they informed our union representative of what had happened. Steve had a disciplinary hearing where he was given a severe reprimand and a warning. Steve tried to argue he never said I'd be fired and I was lying and just decided to go to the doctors, but the duty manager said they heard him admit to it when he said to me that he really didn't mean it. I felt better after a few days, and enjoyed my 2 weeks off, fully paid, and enjoyed the nice weather we had. Meanwhile, Steve was forced to work overtime because we were short-staffed. So thanks to the doctor, instead of being off for a few days, I ended up getting a nice 2-week paid vacation, and Steve was given a final warning, all because he insisted I get a doctor's note.
Story 2. My neighbors wanted to call a professional to mark their property line. My parents agreed. This was a long time ago but I remember it clearly. We moved into a community with tight space in between our house and our neighbors, and we didn't like them being able to see into our kitchen. We put up a bunch of plants, costing thousands, but my parents thought it would be worth it. A week later my parents awoke to the plants completely chopped down. My father was furious, and marched down to our neighbor's house. He told my father the plants were on his property line, therefore he had total right to take them down. He warned that if anything were to go on his property again, he would report us to the authorities immediately. Later that day my father called the company that put in the plants, and with the warranty we could have them replanted next week for no charge. We made sure there was no way it was on our neighbor's property. However, a few days later we caught him chopping them down at 2 a.m. We called the police upon obstruction of property, and after a chat with my neighbor he decided to call a professional and mark his property line. My father agreed. A few days later I got home to find orange tape in my neighbor's yard. Apparently, his fence was 11 feet over our property line. We watched as he took down his fence, completely furious. Within the next month we were enjoying our new space and privacy in our backyard, and my neighbor ended up losing 1/4 of his backyard. My neighbor ended up having to pay almost $10,000 for the destruction of our property, and we got to plant our plants again. Story 3. New neighbor didn't like my old fence so I took it down. About 5 or 6 years ago I built a fence in my backyard. I talked to my neighbors and we decided on a good place to build the fence. We knew an approximate property line based on some survey pins, but were both too cheap to pay for a surveyor. We shook hands and I built the fence. It was a great deal for my neighbors. I paid for everything, built the fence, and all they had to do was give me a thumbs up when it was done. Then, a year later, they sold their house. That meant I got a new neighbor. More specifically, I got Ann. Ann was from the big city. Ann was a realtor. Ann had flipped 8 houses in 12 years. Ann loved this new house and planned on staying for a long time, and Ann had a dog. Razzie was a German Shepherd mix that spent most of the day outside while Ann went to work. Razzie was aggressive towards children, animals, insects, and any plants that waved in the breeze. Razzie also, as Ann once told me, loved to chew on furniture. That's why Razzie stayed outside so much. About 6 months after Ann moved in I saw a surveyor walking around in my neighborhood and he was paying special attention to my backyard. The next day Ann showed up at my front door with a stack of papers and asked me if I was going to pay her for the 9 inches that my fence was encroaching onto her property. I explained the handshake deal with the last neighbors, but she was having no part of it. She wanted the fence moved or she wanted money, no discussions. She had spoken to her lawyer friend and was perfectly happy to take me to court over the fence. She told me, "I don't know how you guys do it out here in the sticks, but where I come from we follow the rules." So, I got rid of the fence. The next day I unscrewed the horizontal rails from the brackets, stacked the fence panels up against my garage, and pulled up the fence posts with my work van. About a week later Aunt shows up at my front door again. She wants to know when I'm going to be building a new fence. Turns out, without my portion of the fence she has not been able to let Razzie out unattended for fear that he will run away, attack something, or get hit by a car. She also told me she can't keep him in the house all day while she's at work anymore. Her furniture and carpet are all but ruined. I told her, well, Anne, I'm not going to be rebuilding the fence. I don't want any legal trouble, and the best way to stay out of trouble is to not build near your property. The look on her face was priceless. I thought she was going to cry. She probably did when she got back home. She tried to protest, saying that she really needed the fence back and she would even help pay for the new one. She told me how much she loved the style and aesthetic of the old one, it was just the location that she had a problem with. I stood firm. There would be no new fence. She never got a fence. She made half-hearted attempts to put up some bamboo fencing, but Razzie tore through that stuff like wet newspaper. Eventually, I sold my place and moved away. I took the old fence panels with me and I still look at them every day when I let my dog out in the morning.
Story 4. You want your two pieces of toast the same size. As you wish. I, F33, live in a regional coastal town in Australia, and used to work in a great little family-run cafe. Think great coffee, yum food, beautiful garden courtyard, and mostly wonderful customers. One summer, during school holidays, on a heaving Sunday morning, I was zooming around doing a quick dish run and started clearing some empty mugs from an older lady, 60s, with her two young grandchildren. She had just received her breakfast and was adding condiments to her two pieces of toast. She stopped me and said, "I'm just looking at the menu and I can see that I paid the same price, $3, for each of these two pieces of toast, but they aren't exactly the same size." I look at her toast and they are both large, but one is approximately 10% smaller than the other, so I assume she's just making convo and I smile, say, "Yeah," and continue grabbing items. She stares at me and says again, "They aren't the same size, but I paid the same for each of them, that's not really fair." I realize she's serious and start telling her that this is because we use a local, handmade sourdough from a beautiful wood-fired bakery baked literally just 7 kilometers away. The loaves are rustic, not factory perfect. She's not having a bar of what I'm saying, insisting she's paid the same price and she wants two pieces of toast the same size. This is when my incredulity ends and my petty steps in. Cue, malicious compliance. Fine, I'll be back in a couple of minutes. I take her toast into my boss F33, tell her the story, and she's like, "Say no more, friend, I've got it." Proceeds to cuts two equal-size slices of bread from the smaller end of a loaf, and toasts them perfectly. I then have the pleasure of taking two pieces of obviously smaller toast to the lady, and say, "Here's your two pieces of toast, the same size." The look of shock, turn anger, turn embarrassment on her face was absolutely delicious. You want to behave like a toddler, then you can eat like one too.